Welcome everybody to the IAA webinar on the paper titled The Climate Change Adaptation Gap, an Actuarial Perspective. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody who listens to the webinar. My name is Gábor Hanak. I'm from Hungary, and I'm the chair of the Climate Risk Task Force, or shortly CRTS, which produced this paper together with its drafting team. My co-presenters come from the drafting team, and we will present the paper, a summary of the most important messages in the paper. If you can go back to one slide, please, Kamali. There are some housekeeping rules. Firstly, the meeting will be recorded. So if you don't want to be part of the recording, then don't contribute. Questions and comments may be made through the Q&A facility of Zoom. If you can find it somewhere in the menu toward the bottom, at least in my Zoom at bottom, you open Q&A and you can type in your question or comment. The recording and the slide deck, which is presented at the webinar, will be uploaded to the IA website within the next day or so, and will be made available to the participants. So the presenters of the paper are Aisling Kennedy, Sam Garman, and Stuart Vason. I would like to introduce in turn. Aisling is an actuary with over 35 years experience in the financial services and healthcare sectors. She's an independent non-executive director of several companies encompassing insurance and public and voluntary sectors. Until 2020, she was head life and health pricing for UK, Ireland, and Israel at C3. She has also formerly had several other roles. She's a fellow and a former council member of the Society of Actuaries in Ireland. Sam is a former director and consulting actuary for PricewaterhouseCoopers in Chicago. Sam has served in several leadership roles in the IA, including as chairman of the Insurance Accounting Committee and the Resource and Environment Working Group. Sam was president of the Society of Actuaries between 1995 and 1996. Stuart has more than 40 years of actuarial and supervisory management experience and a long history of various IA leadership roles. Stuart continues to be actively involved in the work of the actuarial profession. He currently serves as the IAA delegate to the Life Section Board. He served as Senior Director, Actuarial Division of the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, Canada, which is the regulator. He was actively involved between 2008 and 2015 in international regulatory matters as OSFI's, so the regulator's representative to the IAIS. There are some other authors, and Aisling will introduce in one of her slides the other authors. The IAA decided 3 years ago, so in 2020, to set up a task force and pursue a strategic initiative of climate-related issues. And then the Climate Risk Task Force was established in 2020. Since then, 6 papers have been published, and 2 others are in the pipeline. You can find those publications on the IA website. And in the meantime, the Climate Risk Task Force, the CRT, have produced a joint paper with the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. So it's working group 1, which is called Summary for Actuaries. In line with the IA's vision and mission, we want to contribute to the global discussions on climate-related issues with an actual insight and clearly show how actuaries can handle complex issues and add value. We also want to inform all interested actuaries around the globe about the efforts made by our task force and its drafting teams, and how those efforts can be viewed and built on from an actual perspective. All authors of the adaptation paper, so the paper of which is the topic today, shortly called adaptation paper, and the members of our task force are excited about the publication of the paper and what kind of impact it will make. Adverse outcomes of climate change have already been seen on all continents and in most countries for a long time. They're likely to get progressively worse. Even with extensive mitigation actions, these types of changes are highly likely to continue to accelerate. Moreover, the consequences of climate change disproportionately affect vulnerable populations. The best defense against future climate-related risks and damages is to transform systems proactively, to build resilience, and investment in climate change mitigation and adaptation now can also reduce the ultimate cost of climate change significantly. However, progress on climate adaptation has been slower than perhaps it should have been. There's a substantial gap relative to the level of adaptation likely to be needed given the predicted level of global warming. So this is the so-called adaptation gap, the topic of the paper. So having said that, I will pass over the floor to Aisling, and in turn, Aisling will pass it over to Sam and then Stuart. So Aisling, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Gabor. Next slide, please, Amali. A paper like this is very much a group effort, and I would like to begin by thanking my fellow authors listed here. You will have the opportunity to hear from Sam and Stuart later on in this webinar. We also benefited from input from around the globe with contributions from Ashish, Bertha, and Didier. In fact, while we were drafting the paper, Didier moved continent as well as welcoming a new baby. So we were quite a productive group. The area of climate adaptation has perhaps had less actuarial involvement to date than other climate-related work. And for me, in any case, the drafting of this paper was very much a learning experience as we went through the process. I am very grateful to my co-authors, and I hope you will find it a useful read. Next slide. You can find the paper on the homepage of the IAA website, as Gabor has said, or also using the link here. I would also like to draw your attention to the accompanying glossary, which is the repository of all the defined terms used in IAA climate-related risk publications. It is updated in tandem with the publication of each of the IAA's climate papers, and it is a very useful resource, especially because certain terms are used in a climate-related context that may have a somewhat different meaning than in a traditional actuarial context. Next slide. This slide lists the various sections of the paper. Of course, there's also an introduction and executive summary, as you would expect, and Gabor has given a little flavor of the executive summary in his opening remarks. Today, I will cover sections 1 and 5. Sam will then speak to sections 2 and 3, and Stuart will cover sections 4 and 6. Next slide. This next slide shows a central figure from the paper. Limiting global warming requires mitigation measures to reduce emissions and the removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. But even if we limit global warming to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees centigrade, as per the ambition of the Paris Agreement, there will be a substantial impact on human and natural systems. And so, as well as mitigation, we need adaptation action on a transformational scale. Similar to the 3 lines of defense model for risk management, this figure applies a 3 lines of defense perspective to climate-related risk, where the 3 lines comprise mitigation, adaptation, and loss recovery. Adaptation represents a line of defense that can eliminate or reduce potential damages and losses due to climate-related risk. Key elements of the climate change process are shown in the boxes in the left-hand column in figure 1. A central role is played by the emission of greenhouse gases. Meteorological processes then lead to changes in climate, which can damage human health, property, and other resources. The right-hand column of figure 1 indicates the key lines of defense against loss due to these factors. Mitigation, the first 2 boxes on the right, are the first line of defense and are used to both reduce the amount of emissions and capture and store some of the concentration of gases from the atmosphere, either through natural means such as carbon sinks or through carbon capture technologies. The second line of defense is adaptation, the process of adjusting to climate change and its effects. For example, the strengthening of building codes to address the increased variability and extremes of rain, wind, and heat is an adaptation measure. The third line of defense, loss or disaster recovery, aims to minimize the ultimate losses that result from the damages induced by climate change. This recovery may come from insurance or public or charitable funds. A key element of the recovery process is learning lessons from damages incurred, especially to plan for enhanced future adaptation that may range from improving building structures to relocating from high-risk areas. It's important, before moving on from this slide, to highlight that there are both synergies and trade-offs between adaptation and mitigation. This is represented by the two arrows to the right. For example, measures to protect ecosystems, such as enhanced farmland management, can both assist adaptation to climate change and enhance carbon storage. However, some adaptation options may have adverse consequences that involve trade-offs with mitigation objectives. For example, the use of air conditioning to deal with heat stress is an adaptation measure that increases energy use and may therefore be undesirable from a mitigation perspective. Of course, as well as being unaffordable for many vulnerable populations. Another point to mention is that benefits from climate mitigation are global in nature, whereas adaptation actions and benefits tend to be more on a local or regional level. And as Gabor has mentioned, the parts of the world that will be most affected by climate change are often those with fewer resources available for both adaptation and mitigation. Next slide. The next slide, just one back, actually. Thank you. Perfect. Highlights the definitions of some key terms that we use in the paper. Resilience, a familiar term in the context here, involves improving resilience, building on an assessment of current and expected future climate risk profiles to adequately prepare for tomorrow. Adaptive capacity, and the paper discusses potential limits to adaptive capacity. Under a high physical risk scenario, for example, certain adaptation options may no longer be sufficient. Future temperature or drought conditions in some parts of the world may not allow outside work in the middle of the day. And already this year, we've seen record temperatures emerging in many parts of the world. Similarly, existing flood defense infrastructure may no longer be sufficient in the face of increasing sea levels, and it may not be feasible, in fact, to enhance that defense infrastructure to cope with rising sea levels. Then finally, maladaptation. And here I will give an example by way of explanation. The use of irrigation, which helps stabilize and increase crop yields, it's often a preferred strategy for farmers and policymakers, but it can also be associated with a range of adverse outcomes, including groundwater over-extraction. And large-scale irrigation can affect local and regional climates in terms of both temperature and precipitation change, as can be seen on the east coast of Africa, drought arising from irrigation practices in India. Next slide. So to talk a bit about cascading and compounding risks, the dynamic nature of climate change creates an environment where multiple climate hazards can occur simultaneously and interact with other non-climate related risks, resulting in compound effects and cascading risks. Cascading risk is when a primary event, such as heavy rainfall or rapid snowmelt, is followed by a chain of one or more other events, such as consequential flooding or landslides. Compounding risk, as the term suggests, represents a combination of events that occur at the same time. Both types of risks lead to impacts that are more severe than if they had occurred separately. An example of compounding risk is the concurrence of heat waves and severe droughts in Europe in recent years. In the summer of 2022, the combination of evaporation due to a series of heat waves and the severe lack of rain resulted in water levels falling to extremely low levels in rivers and lakes. In addition to the significant supply chain disruption that ensued, these conditions forced several nuclear power plants to reduce output because river temperatures were too high to cool the plants. Cascading risks may result in significant losses in geographic areas and population segments particularly exposed and vulnerable to them. Climate-related risk drivers may also worsen non-climatic risk drivers. As an example, many health-related risks can be affected by climate change, especially affecting those with a higher baseline risk, including the elderly and those with chronic conditions. And given demographic trends and the aging of the world's population, this health impact will be further compounded by an increase in those vulnerable populations. And then finally, to note, political risks may also be exacerbated by climate-related risks. For example, strife resulting from scarcity of resources. Next slide. Adaptation plans will therefore need to take into account potential cascading and compounding risks, and actuarial scenario modeling techniques may be useful in this regard. Adaptation plans also need to recognize and account for the key characteristics of climate-related risks and their unprecedented nature. And countries around the world, and also both businesses and regional governments, are moving to put in place adaptation plans. Figure 2 from the paper here on the slide provides an extract from New Zealand's most recent National Adaptation Plan by way of example. Given the level of complexity and uncertainty that permeates climate-related risk assessment, there are many challenges involved in developing adaptation plans, but multiple frameworks for assessment of vulnerability are being developed, and consistent with current actuarial practice, a commonality among those is a greater focus on a range of possibilities and scenario analysis. Next slide, please. The paper outlines various types of adaptation action, including those listed on this slide, and I will briefly speak to each one. Building codes, which I've already mentioned, and land use policies are important in the context of storm, flood, and wildfire risk, as well as sea level rise. For example, you may have seen that California has mandated special building codes for new homes built in risky fire zones, known as wildland urban interface codes. In looking at building codes, a shift in mindset is required to reflect both future climate conditions and also the greater future uncertainty. Today, current building codes tend to take a view of risk based on present conditions, whereas in designing future building codes, conditions over the expected future lifetime of new buildings need to be considered. And in relation to future uncertainty, most building codes today are based on a static view of risk from an engineering perspective and do not necessarily consider alternative future states, whereas a stochastic view that considers potential adverse scenarios would be more appropriate. This is an area where an actuarial perspective can add significant value. Heat health action plans then are very important because extreme heat can lead to excess morbidity and mortality. A heat health action plan needs to be specific to the context, but can potentially include warning systems and solutions such as climate-friendly urban design and planning and nature-based approaches. Then agricultural practices. So the impacts of climate change are becoming increasingly evident for the agricultural sector. Here in Ireland, that's a very big debate at the moment. Potential adaptation actions include the use of drought-resistant seeds that allow plants to survive during periods of drought, intercropping, where several crops are planted in the same field to help the plants be less susceptible to disease, and precision agriculture, such as the application rate of fertilizers being calibrated to accurately reflect the soil requirements of a particular area. As farming practices evolve to adapt to climate change, the insurance programs that support them also have to adapt. Climate scenarios can be applied to augment historic data for pricing purposes, and incentives could also be provided through premium discounts to reward best practices. Then, sea level rise and other water-related risks. A significant increase in sea level is already locked in, as we know, given the global warming that has already occurred. The ultimate extent of sea level rise, however, is highly dependent on global mitigation efforts and is susceptible to several tipping points, including melting of the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets. Responses to ongoing sea level rise and land subsidence in low-lying coastal cities and settlements and small islands include protection, accommodation, advance, which means the creation of artificial land above the sea, and planned relocation. For inland flooding, combinations of non-structural measures like early warning systems and structural measures like levees can be implemented. Enhancing natural water retention by means such as restoring wetlands and rivers, land use planning, for example, no-build zones, or upstream forest management can further reduce flood risk. We will have, when Stuart speaks later on, we'll have an example. One of our case studies relates to sea level rise. Supply chain management strategies then, and climate change will have a profound impact on global supply chains. As just one example, again, the droughts in Europe in 2022 that I mentioned earlier exposed the vulnerability of European supply chains that are reliant on river transport as river levels fall or fell due to drought on the Rhine, Danube, and tributary rivers. Long-term solutions to that particular problem may include changes to ship construction and operation, forecasting systems, logistic chain adjustments, and river management measures. But much wider problems will exist in relation to supply chain, and a wide range of solutions will be required. Planning for supply chain resilience will need to take account of not only individual climate risk factors, but also the effect of compounding and cascading risks and other risks such as political risks. Managed relocation, then finally, some locations may not be able to adequately manage the losses from persistent severe weather events or temperature extremes, and managed relocation may need to be considered in those situations. In fact, already approximately 4.4 million people have been relocated through managed retreat programs over the last 20 years. A cost-benefit analysis over the long term shows managed relocation can provide better value than other resilience options, and planning frameworks will need to be developed to facilitate this. But it's a really tricky area, and of course, the affected populations must be sufficiently engaged and their awareness of risks raised for relocations to be successful. Next slide, please. So here on this slide are some further considerations which are addressed in a chapter of the paper, starting with time horizons. Both adaptation and mitigation actions require investment, and in both cases there is a mismatch in timing between their costs, which are incurred up front, and their benefits, which accrue over a long period in the form of either enhanced resilience or less severe losses or damages. This mismatch is a barrier to effective action and needs to be addressed in cost-benefit analysis, and both short-term and long-term perspectives need to be considered. Vulnerable populations, we've already mentioned this a couple of times. Unfortunately, the environmental and health consequences of climate change disproportionately affect low-income countries and poor people in high-income countries. Climate change, as I've mentioned, is a driver of migration patterns already, and this will increase in future. As an example of the disproportionate impact on less well-off populations, a recent UK assessment of future flood risk found that those living in deprived areas, as measured by income distribution, will suffer disproportionately as flood risk worsens. Another study from the US showed that in Phoenix, which is America's hottest large city, neighborhoods in the lowest 10% of income distribution are on average 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than those in the top 10%. Coordinated action. Coordination and engagement across levels of government, business, and community is needed. For example, insurance companies can potentially partner with governments at national, regional, and municipal levels to establish appropriate regulatory frameworks to promote, for example, land use planning, building codes, and early warning and emergency response systems. And public and private partnerships are likely to be needed to finance adaptation. The private sector can potentially contribute new systems and technologies for adaptation, as well as financing, while the public sector can provide the required institutional frameworks, and risk can be shared between the public and private parties. In terms of the role for governments and supervisors, you will see in the paper that it's clear that effective incentives are required in order to drive the actions needed to reduce and manage climate-related risks, and hence public policy responses are needed as part of the solution to drive effective adaptation. And then finally, the role of disclosure. Current corporate climate-related disclosures are mainly focused on mitigation action with little reference to adaptation. In some cases, that's also true of the reporting being done by governments. And this is an issue, certainly in relation to corporate disclosures, that requires more attention from both standard setters and investors. And here I will mention the previous paper in the IAA series, which most recently addressed the fast-changing landscape of climate-related disclosures, which are rapidly changing. So on this note, I will now hand over to Sam, who will take us through the next couple of sections.
Thanks, Aisling. I'm really pleased to be part of the author team in this paper, because I believe that adaptation is a significant issue that actuaries should become much more involved with than they have in the past. Next. But the question is, why is adaptation a concern? I think fundamentally that adaptation can affect insurance experience, which actuaries will have to reflect in their pricing and product management and financial reporting down the line in their regular work. In addition, it can expand the influence and work of actuaries in the future. Actuaries have the capability of recognizing the practicality and importance of adaptation. We can leverage our experience in risk management practice in this area, and indeed have shown an ability to manage uncertainty over long time horizons. Increasingly, this climate is a long-term issue. We've always had climate, we always will have climate, but the question is what the changes that have come upon climate have an effect on society, governments, and individuals, as well as business. Actuaries in this area are part of interdisciplinary work in teams. They have impacts on insurance systems, protection gaps, insurability, and the building of resilience of the private sector as well as the public sector. I think that the actuaries are poised to be able to anticipate the effects on insurance costs, and it's really more a significant issue in developing realistic scenarios. There are several IAA papers that the Climate Task Force has developed on developing scenarios, and I think that the application of scenarios to actuarial practice is a significant development, not only in the financial reporting of the insurance companies, pension plans, et cetera, but also in this area as well, into a broader environment. Next. Which brings me to the question of what is the role? It has roles in several areas. One, in property casualty or general insurance, that it served as a key friction that makes many economies function well and effectively. So therefore, it is an important function of society. And I think that the better that actuaries can help insurance operate, the more effective and efficient the economies will be able to be available and provided. Actuaries can help, or insurance can help adaptation objectives being achieved, including incentives. And I emphasize the word is incentives, as Aisling also mentioned, that individuals and businesses should incorporate in their normal course of business. Examples I I won't go into them because Aisling mentioned the ones provided. In some cases, an issue that has been raised is that particularly in the property casualty or general insurance, we're dealing with 1-year time horizons in terms of insurance contracts. This can be a problem in some cases, but I think that we've seen the recent experience we've seen shows that these risks can be significant now, not just in 10 years or 50 years, but they can happen at any time. And I think that the probabilities of adverse events can be significant. It's not just in the property casualty insurance area, but also the health insurance area. Incentives to enhance healthcare in response to disasters and emergencies are becoming increasingly important to develop and to help providers of health insurance as well. I not mentioned this slide, but also life insurance. Mortality, I believe, that will be increasingly affected down the road, and therefore actuaries should be aware of those potential risks. Next. This graphic just indicates and really summarizes what Aisling mentioned before. Bottom line, actuaries have always been involved with risk. And indeed, in order to be able to understand, recognize, and project potential risks, actuaries have had to understand, at least on the surface of it, the hazards that the insurance contracts provide protection against. In order to do that, you have to understand not only the hazards, but also the exposures of individuals as well as their vulnerabilities. We've talked about vulnerable populations, but in some cases, climate hazards can affect everyone. In fact, some areas, higher income individuals in higher income areas can be more affected than others. An example is a wildfire smoke risk on mortality. The properties and lives of those that have built up on coastlines and close to forests have increased vulnerability. And so far, in some cases, in some areas, it's the wealthy who have been able to afford these houses. Yet at the same time, they also have given themselves exposure to these risks. So they're vulnerable, although they're not quite as sensitive, because hopefully they will have been smart enough to build stronger houses, residences, etc. But sometimes that is not the case. The risk arises when those who are vulnerable or whose properties are vulnerable are exposed to these hazards. The goal of adaptation is to eliminate to the extent possible or to reduce the impact of adverse climate changes. Next. This circular diagram or figure is from the paper, but it's no different than many risk management processes. I'll go through them very briefly, but note the order may be applied differently by project, start in different spots, and may also involve feedback loops. So even though it's a simplistic set of arrows, it's not necessarily as simple as that. In terms of risk management, clearly you identify both the exposure and the vulnerabilities of the population and property. In order to do that, in order to be able to satisfy and fulfill the key elements of risk management, the actuary needs to obtain a relevant and reliable data and information, and it uses it to build and assess the situation and build their models. In turn, that cost-benefit analysis leads to hopefully a better plan. But usually plans need finance. And I think as a question already came up in the Q&A, finance is a key area of adaptation that's really important, particularly for many of the vulnerable, in other words, not just countries, but individuals. And therefore, in some cases, they may need some additional sources of revenue, and that continues to be one of the challenges in this area. Part Part of the plan is to implement. Sometimes it's very nice to talk and nice to develop a plan, but the implementation of these risk adaptation measures can be most important and most difficult. And in any risk management process, the question is how best to monitor it. Once you go through this process, the key issue is, what did you learn? What did we learn? What's worked? What hasn't worked? What are best practices, or at least better practices in this area? And how can we improve? In the next couple of slides, I'll go through and expand a little bit on a couple of these steps. Next. The identify exposure vulnerability step. In some cases, terms of climate change is looked at as a very broad brush set of issues, but it really consists of individual climate hazards. And we've already touched on several of them, whether it be temperature, precipitation, humidity, wind, etc. Each of these hazards can be looked at in terms of the level, variability, and severity. It's very useful to look at trends, but trends can be deceiving. Some of these hazards do not occur, like an automobile automobile accidents. There are not a lot of them. Sometimes they happen once a year, sometimes once a decade. The key issue is to look at the probabilities, but also looks at what the trends will indicate and what are the leading indicators of these of potential damage functions. Since we're dealing with property and lives, it's key to identify both exposure and vulnerability. I think it's also important to identify areas of risk. Clearly, since there's oftentimes limitations in terms of types of methods, there are many hazards involved in addition to climate hazards. So the users probably have to prioritize these and identify what are the most important ones that are relevant to the location that the property or life is in. And it's as any risk management individual or expert will tell you, it's the process is important. You've got to touch base in some of every one of the steps indicated. But at the same time, that we're looking at trying to reduce hazards and costs, also keep an eye out to benefits and opportunities. Next. Obtain data and information. As I mentioned, recognizing types of risks that are potentially involved in adaptation implementation, be aware of the relevant regulations and laws. In addition to the protection gaps, some protection gaps are intentional. That is, that the individual has to, or business or individual has to recognize what types of gaps exist and what are the potential damages that affect yourselves, even after insurance or other financing mechanisms. Obtaining relevant data. In some cases, climate change is built up a solid base of data, but yet some of it is still under development. It still can be improved in many areas, particularly in terms of location and geographical dispersion. Also, there's attribution problems in terms of the data. In some cases, people can get hung up by looking at is this caused by climate change or is it not? And I think in terms of preparing adaptation plans, it doesn't really make much difference. Climate risks and climate exposures are really important. And so therefore, don't try to say, well, what's the adaptation for the change? It's what's the adaptation needed to minimize the risks. But unlike a mitigation, the data can differ by hazard, and therefore it's a really complex issue. I know I've had some property in the mountains in the United States, and we've don't have flood risks in, oh yes, we do have flood risks in terms of winter snow runoff, but we have The next month, we have wildfire risks. There are potentially a number of risks, and the question is, how do you use your scarce resources to protect yourself? There are gaps and inconsistencies in data that limit our ability to address these. And in some cases, you have to you really start digging. Hopefully, you can utilize some of the resources that the IA is identified, but in addition, you might have to go beyond to data initiatives that have been developed or by the UN that they're given here. Next. Assess and model. That's just classically the area that actuaries have gotten involved with. I don't think they should be limited to this step, but this is obviously important in terms of assessing the exposures and vulnerabilities that I've already mentioned. It's the fundamental piece is a cost-benefit analysis. It quantifies the risks and damages. In some cases, climatologists, meteorologists can identify what is going to happen, but in terms of practical application, what are the potential damages that can occur? What types of properties are at risk? What types of mortality? When and where do we need to move people or move resources? I think it demonstrates the value of investments or rules. And I think that these, in just the aspect of restorations of wetlands or mango groves, really simple things that are done initially for other reasons, but yet are also very important for trying to reduce the effects. Actuarial modeling, crucial here, even though you can look at the IAMs or the integrated assessment models of climatologists, that we need to make sure that extends one step farther to the insurance areas. But in doing so, we have to consider likely behavior in responses to the incentives provided. And bottom line, I'll just point out that last word in this slide, which is judgment. There's a lot of data available, but the future is uncertain, and therefore we have to use our professional judgment. Next. The monitor, I mentioned this earlier. It's the regular evaluation of the effectiveness of the current adaptation processes to see where we should go and where we should spend our resources. But it's harder to measure adaptation. That is, the effect of adaptation, successful adaptation, is avoidance. And how do you measure avoidance? In some cases, we can look at it on what if we hadn't put in that adaptation, how much would it have been worth in similar situations? These are steps that are needed to be evaluated carefully. Next. I had to add a slide on uncertainties. Actuaries have dealt with uncertainties throughout our professional careers. And we've dealt with them by developing stochastic or analysis, sensitivity analysis. Stuart's been involved significantly in developing regulatory scenarios that insurance companies can utilize. Well, climate areas catching up with the actual profession. They have been developing with the various IPCC reports a number of useful scenarios. The IA has developed 3 papers in this area that are also quite useful. I highly recommend their reviewing them in terms of applicability and developing your own scenarios. But it also has to incorporate the risk and loss preferences for both the insurer and the insureds, and to provide effective and meaningful insurance products, you have to understand the preferences of the individuals and businesses involved. They can differ and can significantly impact not only whether or not you adapt to climate change, but how extensively you plan for it. In terms of managing uncertainties, and it's a difficult concept for me to get my head around, but to the extent that you can, have to consider alternative approaches, and most commonly modeled through a scenario analysis, which I highly recommend, if you haven't been involved in developing representative scenarios, this is an area that actuaries can really play a role. And contingency planning is becoming more and more important. Next. Bottom line is decision-making. Decision-making by the actuary, decision-making by the, if you're working for or providing services to an insurance entity, is what prices and products you're offered, how do you being assessed. But in terms of making effective decisions, you have to have available, reliable, and relevant data and information. And I've stressed that a couple of times, is let's either utilize the data that's out there, or help in the development and identification of holes where data should be better used. Whether through whether the decision-making is strategic, tactical, or operational, I think that the actuaries can be involved in each of those areas. In addition, even though in my various discussions with others on adaptation, actuaries typically have been associated with insurance and effectiveness of insurance programs. But I think that we can utilize our experience and background in insurance into other areas that need to be examining how to adapt to the potential damages of climate and climate change. In order to do that, in order to make effective plans, not only you have to keep in mind the users or the decision makers, but also the stakeholders. Views and risk preferences are crucial in terms of coming up with effective decisions. And those decisions can be either a global, national, or local area. Citywide planning in terms of climate change adaptation planning is quite important, and I think that you can get involved not only through insurance, but also in the local and regional areas of concern. I think that time and uncertainty are crucial issues and elements that we have to be aware of, and actual practice always has. And I think that that's the last slide. So I will turn it over to Stuart.
Thanks very much, Sam. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. In my part of the presentation, I'm just going to go over the case studies that were included in the paper, and also the conclusions to our report. Before I go into just back one. Yeah, just back. Yeah, thanks. So there are 3 case studies that are included within the paper, and the purpose of the case studies was really to give you a taste, I guess, of the adaptation issues, actually the impact of climate change in a number of jurisdictions, and what those jurisdictions are doing as they begin to think about possible adaptation actions that can take them forward. So we've got 3 case studies that I'll lead you through. And so let's, next slide. So the first one was brought to us by Bertha Pilgrim, who lives in Barbados, and naturally it's about Barbados. So thank you, Bertha. And I hope as you think about this case study and actually the subsequent ones to come, that you think not just about the specific example, the specific location that is included in the case study, but you think about wider application of the issues that are arising in these case studies to other jurisdictions in the world, perhaps your own. So for Barbados, the coastal zone around the island is its main economic asset. Tourism for Barbados represents 39% of its gross domestic product. As well, its beaches are subject to erosion and storms. Of course, that heavily affects the prospects for tourism for the island. Climate change effects have had a very significant effect on the surrounding reef. Can you go back? Yeah, the surrounding reef for the island. as a result of storm severity and also sea level rise. And I would also mention the temperature change, of course, as well for the sea. So the picture that is included on this slide includes some example of headlands that are man-made that have been introduced in parts of the island in order to stabilize the shoreline and to maintain the sand close to shore. So we'll talk about that in a sec. So next slide. So Barbados has been considering for many years how best to protect their shoreline. And just a very limited example of their efforts in this area was to construct a series of 5 headlands in this particular project that Bertha brought forward that jut 20 to 25 meters out into the sea. There were substantial construction costs to do this work, but thankfully it was covered by the Inter-American Development Bank. Longer-term adaptation for Barbados also requires investments in wastewater treatment and relocation of structures potentially further back from the sea. So good news is that this limited project has been considered a success to the island. Next slide. So even though actuaries weren't directly involved in this work, what are some of the actuarial implications going forward, similar types of projects? This particular case study indicates the importance of considering the effects of climate change and possible adaptation measures for Barbados, its land, its people, its structures, even its economy. So addressing these issues requires their inclusion in risk management and scenario analysis, and Sam was just talking to us about that. It requires cooperation and partnership among all stakeholders to minimize protection gaps. Actuaries have strong roles in providing advice on these sorts of matters to governments and other stakeholders. So in this area as well, climate-related risks and adaptation, actuaries can play a strong role, a very useful role. Next slide. So let's go on to case study 2, brought to us by Ashish Ranjan from India. So we thank him for this. And it's about the Kaveri River, which is a substantial river in the southern part of India. It's rain-fed. And it relies on 2 sets of monsoon rains coming from both the southwest and from the northeast. An important feature of the Kaveri is the substantial height differentiation between its source and its outlet in the Bay of Bengal. And that leads to the very useful property that hydroelectric power can be generated by this river. However, the river has many uses for the surrounding population, which is quite dense, both for irrigation, for drinking water. The city of Bangalore relies substantially on the fresh water coming from the Kaveri River. For household consumption of water, irrigation, and the generation of electricity, the number of dams along the Kaveri River. So next slide. So the river, unfortunately, has been subject to a number of challenges over not just recent years, but over a very long period of time. And perhaps a principal issue relates to water sharing. And this is conflicts between the various groups, whether it be the farmers looking for water to irrigate their crops, enough supply to cities like Bangalore to get drinking water, And then just what happens if there isn't enough water behind the hydroelectric dams to generate hydroelectricity. So as a result, these conflicts have risen to such a level in this region that the Supreme Court in India has actually had to make a number of rulings in order to settle some of the disputes. Rainfall as well is absolutely key, as you can tell, because it's a rain-fed river in the end. The variability of the monsoons and perhaps how they're being shifted by climate change is a very important issue. But there's another aspect to rainfall that a number of the farmers have noted, that it seems in recent years that rainfall comes less frequently, but when it does come, it comes all at once. And as a result, their crops are suffering. Next slide. And the crops are suffering because the intensification of farming, forest reduction, urbanization has all made it difficult for the water when it falls on the land to soak in, to be absorbed, and to be fully useful. As a result, it has a tendency to run off quickly. And a bottom line, which has been noticed on the previous slide, there was a photo of a gentleman who was inspecting the dry riverbed. It's actually been the case that the Cauvery River has failed to, or at least some of its tributaries, they've run dry before they even reach the sea. So a very small but partial adaptation project has to begin reforesting the banks of the Cauvery River, using billions of tree saplings to be planted along the river. Local farmers do the planting. The benefits include better soil and water retention and improved resilience to weather extremes. So as you think about this particular case study, I would also bring up perhaps other rivers we can think of. Aisling spoke of the Rhine River and some of its recent challenges. The Colorado River in the United States was one that sprang to my mind as I thought about the Cauvery River. Okay, next slide. So what are some of the possible implications of this case study for actuaries? Adaptation really can make a difference, especially if it's acted on in sufficient scale and in combination with other activities. Actuaries can play a role in advising stakeholders on the collective issues, the favorable impacts of adaptation, and the risks of inaction. Actuaries have very strong skills in risk management, healthcare, losses, damages, etc. So as a result, vulnerable populations can be better protected, and the costs of climate change are shared among a number of public-private partnerships. Next slide. So third case study is something I became aware of. It was a combination effort between the Insurance Bureau of Canada and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. And in 2020, they produced a report, the cost of climate adaptation at the local level. And it was a very interesting report, in my view, in which they tried to estimate the cost of adapting municipal infrastructure to climate change. The next slide. So according to the report, municipalities in Canada are owners and operators of 60% of the public infrastructure in Canada. So they're really on the front lines of climate change and the solutions to protect Canadians. But with such a huge investment, municipalities don't have the fiscal muscle to shoulder all the costs of adapting to climate change. It must be a shared responsibility amongst all levels of government. The report estimates that avoiding the worst impacts of climate change could cost Canadian dollars $5 billion a year. Very interestingly, the report indicates that there are various studies that have shown that investments in resilient infrastructure have a return on investment of $6 in averted losses for every dollar spent proactively. I think this should be a key selling feature to all the stakeholders who are involved in this particular question, even though current fiscal dollars are highly fought over in terms of priorities. The benefits in averting future losses can be very significant. Next slide. The report also indicates that 37% of cumulative nature-related losses are not covered by insurance. And you may not be able to read this particular table. The percentage I was referring to is at the bottom right, but you can look for the details in our paper. This table prepared by the IBC splits the uncovered losses by their source, whether they're floods, convection storms, hurricanes, etc. Next slide. So the actuarial implications of coming out of this report for me, as I read the report, are that we need to foster greater use of public-private partnerships to reduce protection gaps and make effective use of our insurance mechanisms. A key issue is that we need to fight the fiscalization of climate costs, because that's a natural reaction. Let's leave it to the federal government or national governments to shoulder those costs, but it must be a shared responsibility. Actuaries can certainly play a role in helping to gather data, research on the costs and the benefits of adaptation. We can be a key assist because that's one of our core strengths in that area. We need to ensure clients' risk management incorporates climate-related risk expertise, including the benefits of adaptation measures. Actuaries can really assist stakeholders in understanding the uncertainties involved in modeling climate-related risks, including their adaptation responses. Next slide. So with the last couple of slides, I'll just bring to the conclusions as I see them from our report. The best defense against future climate-related risks is to build resilience and reduce exposure, vulnerability, and inequality that drive disasters and their damages. But this takes long-term planning and accelerated implementation, particularly in the next decade. And this is brought home by the IPCC Working Group 2 report, which was released late last year. If adaptation is invested in now, many of the ultimate costs of climate change can be halved. Now, you'll note that particular quote came from the Canadian Climate Institute. You may wonder how it compares to the $6 of losses versus $1 invested. There is a range, obviously, in estimates of how much can be saved by spending money on adaptation now, but it seems clear the advantages of taking action on adaptation now are formidable. Effective adaptation-related data and information will certainly enable better risk management and planning, but that data in some cases is lacking. The IBC and FCM report I thought was a very helpful start in beginning that dialogue here in Canada. Next slide. And my last slide. Actuaries can contribute to adaptation, not only in the usual areas of actuarial practice, insurance, pensions, healthcare, etc., but through the broader application in risk management, scenario analysis, and cost benefit analysis. We talked about building codes as just one example, but I hope you can see through the course of our presentation, there's so many potential areas in which actuaries can be of assistance. Uncertainty of future outcomes is at the heart of climate change discussion. Understanding and communicating these uncertainties is a key role for actuaries, and it's one that we should be comfortable in embracing. Actuaries can contribute to the interdisciplinary assessment and discussion of adaptation and its impact on financial systems, including talking about protection gaps, vulnerabilities, insurability, and resilience. And I think this is probably a key shift for actuaries, that we would be involved with many other experts in climate-related risks who are not actuaries, assisting and contributing to the debate on how to address climate change and adaptation. Thank you very much. Back to you, Aisling or Gabor.
To Gabor, I think.
Yes. Thank you all. And we are questions and comments session. We've received a number of comments and questions also. Some of them have been answered, more or less, let's put it that way. And we are still open for receiving questions. I would start with one of the questions that I may want to address. To what extent are FMAs, that means full member associations of the IA, so FMAs pushing down the information to their own members? So there are several full member associations of the IA where such information flows both ways. So from the member association to the IA, in particular the Climate Risk Task Force, and backward. We have a CRTF liaison group, so Climate Risk Task Force liaison group, currently with about 20 members. And we have regular meetings where we discuss the both ways communication. You can compare that to the 70 plus FMAs of the IA. So clearly that's a minority. And also I would add that the members of this liaison group are mostly from the bigger and more advanced member associations. For example, I'm not sure if you are aware, but there's a classification of the size of the member associations. So tier 1 is for the biggest ones, and tier 2 is the medium, and tier 3 stands for the smaller associations. So all tier 1 FMAs, member associations, are represented in this liaison group. About half of the tier 2 associations, and only about 4 of the tier 3 association, which is clearly not ideal. And one of the reasons for developing these papers and publishing the CRTF papers is to inform actuaries and how they can be impacted and how they can contribute and what the issues are. And so our mission is, this task force mission is to educate actuaries around the globe, and not just actuaries, but mostly actuaries. There's another question which asked for the intended audience of these papers. So I already answered that in the Q&A window, and my answer was it's primarily actuaries, which is the intended audience, but since the language is not very technical, not very actuarial, we encourage non-actuaries also to read and understand these papers and perhaps relate to these papers. And in particular, we have sent out all the papers published so far, all 6 papers, to our key stakeholders internationally. So all our important stakeholders like the IAIS or the IPCC are aware of these papers, and we have several discussions with them and partly about these papers. So that's one of the questions. Another question to Stuart, perhaps. So what's the reason there is no particular case study that would have shown a more direct actual involvement of the adaptation project? And then a connecting question from the audience is, were actors involved in the coordination of the responses to climate change impacts in the case study countries specifically? And generally, to what extent have policymakers worldwide involved the actual profession in identifying risks and putting together responses to the threats imposed by climate change? So, Stuart, may I ask you to give an answer to that? These couple of questions.
Thanks, Gabor. There was a lot in those questions. We could go on for another half hour, I think, on
Briefly.
fulsome response, but I just give a couple of quick thoughts. First of all, you asked, were actuaries directly involved in the case studies that we brought forward? And the answer is no. The actuaries were involved in bringing the case studies to us, but actuaries were not actually involved in the work involved with those particular case studies. They weren't involved on the ground developing the adaptation solution. We wish, and we wish that there were more examples of actuaries getting directly involved in adaptation measures. It's coming, and work is starting in that area. There's one of our CRTF members, I know, just to read Muslin in Australia, who's directly involved now in some work related to climate change and advising on building codes. So it's a non-traditional climate related practice. And I'm sure that there are other actuaries who are starting to get involved in those roles. And the purpose, I hope, an outcome of our paper is to encourage other actuaries to say, hey, these are areas in which I can contribute in my own jurisdiction and be of assistance in answering these questions. So there's a partial answer on your question there, Gabor. Just is the actuarial profession contributing to the debate about climate issues? We are actively involved with a number of supranational stakeholders. Here I'm speaking from the IAA perspective, whether that be the International Association of Insurance Supervisors. We're talking directly on a regular basis with them as they worry about protection gaps. We've got some work coming up. I think another task force has been struck by the IAA on water-related risks. We are working with the IPCC directly with Working Group 1. We did a joint paper together with them. We're hoping on the topic of adaptation, and I see you've been in touch with the head of that Working Group 2. We're hoping to do a joint paper with them as well on the topic of adaptation. So I'm not sure if I fully answered the questions raised, but there's a contribution to the answer.
Thank you, Stuart. Sam, perhaps can I ask you to mention a concrete example of how actually have involved or should be involved in adaptation? Can you quote a more concrete example?
Yes, I just attending some of the, let's say, a COP meeting. I know that a session on adaptation, there were several references to actuaries. Unfortunately, all of them, as I mentioned, related to in developing insurance programs. whether it be financing programs, spreading the risk associated with them. And I think but some of those same skills that actuaries have been looked to in this area can also be applied to other areas as well. There were several insurance programs that had been developed to spread the risk of whether you look at the mortality aspects, health aspects of let's say vector or mosquito spread diseases. There have been aspects of flood risks. That is, well, we can help the current or the current city, but we also have to be concerned with other residual or consequences. That's the concern about the impact of the community downstream or even upstream in terms of what's the impact of your adaptation or flood protection program. It can help the local communities, but it can hurt another community. I also like to add initially from your comment that Gabor mentioned, which was data. Here is an area that I think actuaries can get more involved with. The impact of understanding misleading data. I've seen all types of data that can potentially be misleading, particularly looking at the mortality aspects. The trend line of the impact on mortality from, let's say, certain types of disasters have been improving over time. Well, if you look at the graphics and just look at the data, you can say, oh, gee, this is a non-problem. But on the other hand, once you start getting into the data, you find out that certain trends are caused by improving air conditioning around the world and in improving early warning indicators in certain countries. So I think a role of the actuaries is actually to be able to understand and interpret misinformation. So hopefully that we aren't so much looked at as being the poo-pooers of certain data, but I think we can also participate in the development of better data and better analysis of trend data.
Thank you. There is another interesting question. Can't actuaries also encourage their insurance companies to invest in adaptation projects to help keep their populations insurable for a longer window, which is a win-win impact? In the Caribbean, the question comes from, I guess, the president of the Caribbean Association. So in the Caribbean, life insurers help finance the construction of public infrastructure, airports, ports by investment in the project finance bonds. They can require certain adaptation features, energy. In the Caribbean, life companies invest in social awareness campaigns, and so on and so on. So win-win situations. Can any one of the presenters comment on this question, which is practically, we should do that, or actually should do that, but a question is asked, can't actually also encourage. So anyone would like to answer?
Stuart, yes, no, I think that's a very good example. What I was going to do in my response was actually just comment that there's another area that we perhaps have not touched on too much in this whole discussion, which Simone, your question was just bringing to my mind, and that's the whole area of disclosure, which is really ramped up in just the last few days, I guess, with the formalization of the ISSB introduction of their standards on climate-related disclosures. And I think that's an area where actuaries can and will be very much involved, not just talking about mitigation and how companies are responding themselves to climate-related risks, but I hope they will also be spending a fair bit of time in their disclosures talking about relevant local adaptation measures as well.
I think there's a significant role that actuaries can play. One is in terms of evaluation of assets. Evaluate, as I think was mentioned in one question. I think that there are many aspects of many investments that are related or have potential climate or climate change risks associated with them. And so therefore, somebody who's just focused on short-term return on a particular asset or investment return may miss some things. So just the actuarial reminders of, well, gee, what are the damage potentials involved in whether it be this company, whether this area, if it's a municipality, for example. Those are the issues that actuaries can raise. In some cases, actuaries may not be able to answer them, but certainly understanding them. And I think a point made by all of the presenters today is time horizons. There are short-term and intermediate terms and long-term horizons, and these are areas that actually would really benefit by having actuarial input, particularly actuaries involved in the whole time perspective of whether it be asset investments, whether it be effectiveness of an adaptation measure, how long an adaptation measure is going to be effective over, are all things that actuarial experience can at least identify what the questions are that need to be addressed, in addition to helping to address or monitor or quantify. Also, almost any development project, depending on the country, has some aspects of climate change and the impacts of climate and weather. And so therefore, you have to take the opportunity not only to invest positively in either a development project or a regular investment product, but also keep in mind that adaptation against these risks is an important element of analysis.
Thank you. Just a short comment about the assets or valuation of assets and climate-related risks. Sam has included an explicit reference in the slide deck about our fourth paper, which is about our asset paper. So exactly on the same subject can be found on the IA website. But what Sam mentioned in his presentation, that for P&C business, the short-term nature of this business or most of these businesses may be incompatible with the long-term risks involved. So there's a often heard excuse, or I would put it that way, within the IA as well. Why should P&C writers be concerned about climate-related risks because of this short-term time horizon, especially about adaptation? Anyone in the presenters would like to address this opinion that the P&C insurers should not be very much concerned about climate-related risks and adaptation?
I think that even though the differences in time frame or horizon are pretty obvious, I think it's the long-term benefit of property and casualty insurance companies to educate their potential applicants and their insureds. Not only is it's a service provided to society by reducing the impacts of potential damages, but also it's a value added to the customers. In addition, I think I mentioned in my presentation that some of these risks, 10 years ago when I first started getting involved in these issues, they were always looking at, like, say, what's the impact in 50 years from now? Well, it's not 50 years in some cases, it's next year. So therefore, even if your experience base in a property casualty analysis only looks at the last 1 or 5 years, you've got to look to see what conditions are likely in the future, and therefore, even in the next year, it can have an impact.
Yeah, and I would just amplify that, Sam, by saying that, perhaps from a risk management perspective, that's a protection for P&C insurers, that they don't have exposure beyond a 1-year time horizon. But from a strategic perspective, in terms of having a long-term business proposition, it's not going to be feasible simply to put premiums up to reflect rising risk, it's going to be necessary for insurers as, you know, part of the ecosystem, the wider ecosystem, to be part of the solution. Otherwise, they won't have any customers in the long term.
I just amplifying it just a little bit, your last comment. This is really important because there's, let's say in the state of California, several homeowners insurers have announced that they're not going to be renewing or issuing new policies, and a significant part of that reason is because of climate change. You know, in some cases, some big areas are going to become uninsurable. So I think it's duty bound to at least maintain the market, and is to try to bolster adaptation. I think it's a community-wide of importance. It's important to the customers in the short term and long term. So that's something to keep in mind.
Thank you. There's a question when we say in the paper or at the presentation that actuaries can do this or that, or actuaries are best placed to provide this or that. Are we referring to the individual actuary or the actual associations? And a connected question: why actuaries? Why not other risk management experts? So why do actuaries want to compete with the experts in the physical sciences? Anyone would address this?
I'll jump in there. I'll start with the second question. I think it's not so much a question of competing, Gabor, as contributing. I think
not my word. It's a word from the question.
Because I think there's opportunities for all experts to do their bit, and I think there are some, as in particular pointed out, some particular features of the training that and skill sets that actuaries have that aren't represented in those who are working more centrally on climate. So I don't think it's a question of competition. I think it's a question of contribution. And to the first question, I think it's both associations and individual actuaries. And I think the opportunities will vary from one country to another, but I think associations have a strong role to play in terms of advocacy and in terms of contributing to public dialogue and consultations. Here in Ireland, there was a national consultation on Ireland's climate action plan. The profession made a contribution to that, responded to that consultation and has issued public statements and had some media coverage. So those are all good things. But I think on the ground, individual actuaries, whether it's in insurance companies, in consulting firms, in asset management, in new areas, Stuart referred to the work that Raid Muslin is doing with the construction industry. There are many, many entry points, I think, for individual actuaries in the course of their work to be part of this work.
Thank you, Aisling. Perhaps I would add that indeed actuaries are best placed to deal with such issues which has financial consequences, which are uncertain and have financial consequences in the future. And they know, or we know, how to professionally address these issues, unlike perhaps other experts or other other disciplines experts. So I think it's our strengths, and we should mention that every time. So I think we are very close to the end, and perhaps one last sentence at the request of our IAA's Actuarial Standards Committee Chair. I would like to let you know that the IAA has decided to work out a statement of intent for an international standard of actuarial practice, which is a moral standard, which is related to IFRS S2. IFRS S2 is the climate-related disclosure standard. Now I can say not draft standard, because yesterday the ISSB, International Sustainable Standard Board, actually issued the first two foundational standards on disclosures, and that's out there from yesterday, and the ICE has been working on developing a statement of intent in the first place, and then will develop an actual model standard on that. So I hope that everybody has learned something. I have, just reading the questions. We don't have much time to continue, so I would like to thank our presenters, Aisling, Sam, and Stuart, and those who attended the meeting. And I would like to wish you a very pleasant further day or night or morning, wherever you are in the globe. So thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.